I very much agree. This whole idea of a decolonial identity, it's very dangerous because what it means is it views the Russian element in the Ukrainian identity as being a foreign imperial relic, something to get rid of. This is, of course, problem yeah, domestically and abroad because, well, we saw this. If you're going to embrace this idea as they did after 2014, then you have to begin to purge the political parties, purge the culture, the religion, the media, language, and across the board. And I often cite Solzhenitsyn. He was making the point that this close connection between the Russians and the Ukrainians were a double-edged sword, because for some Ukrainians, it was the source of brotherhood with the Russians, but for most of the Western Ukrainians, it was the exact opposite. It was what prevented them from being completely sovereign, because if you're essentially one people, then why would you be a separate state? So I always agree that it would be good for Ukraine to develop as a nation building project, to be distinctive from Russia. So this is Ukraine, we are different, but not anti-Russian, because then you trigger both domestic issues as well as international security issues. It would be a bit like Russia decoupling completely or de-Tatarizing. I mean, you can't just get 500 years together and cut it off and pretend as if, after all this year, it has to be included into the more inclusive concept of what it then means to be Russian. You can't cut off these other groups. But with the Russian, it's more complicated, because, as you said, whatever relationship they have with the ethnic Russians or Russian speakers in Ukraine, this impacts the relationship with Russia and also makes them more vulnerable to being exploited by foreign actors. Because I think that if you have foreign elements, be it's traditionally the Germans or the Americans or British, want to create a Europe which is more de-Russified, then you're going to align with these more nationalist elements within Ukraine. But how do you see the interaction, though, between these different levels? It looks, if the US and Russians can make some kind of a deal, it makes it easier to sort the other issues, doesn't it? But like a nationalist government in Kiev doesn't only seek NATO membership, it would also seek to purge the Russian culture out of the historical Russian lands, which is also not acceptable. So how do you see this working together?
Yeah, that's part of the difficulty in fitting it all together. It's like a Rubik's cube when it's so hard to get faced all together. And of course, all these issues interact with each other. For example, the United States, and explicitly Zbigniew Brzezinski back in the 1990s in the Grand Chessboard, where he said that they've worked assiduously. The US Embassy in Kiev has worked assiduously to exploit the divisions within Ukraine to facilitate and empower one constituency as part of the attempt to contain and marginalize and even humiliate, if you like, Russia. And so there's been a lot these levels. Of course, now when the United States has changed its tune, they no longer, well, we don't know what Trump's doing, because he's playing, he also is quite deceptive in all sorts of ways. For example, the drone strike or whatever it was towards Valdai, the 91 drones in the first days of January, were clearly facilitated by the United States one way or the other. So, but yeah, it's a fundamental question. How do these things all fit together? And it's, I separate them purely for analytical purposes. Otherwise, in a sense, to say that these are the threads. Other approaches to it would say, well, these levels is a bit mechanical, and we could name other levels. And one of the fifth one, for example, would be this larger, the way the war is presented as a larger civilizational struggle, the Russian barbarian hordes to the east. And that, of course, brings us back not just to the 1945, the 80 years, post-war years, but then to the larger question, which I do think is fascinating. And a lot of Russian commentators like Sergei Alexandrovich Karaganov, for example, focuses on the 500 years of Russia's difficult relationship with Europe, and that this civilizational conflict And of course, many in the West, Biden explicitly said it was a war for civilization. Again, for the rules-based order was one manifestation of it, but more widely, the Western culture, the rule of law, and so on, against the Russian despotism. These are exactly the civilizing mission, and Macron has talked about it as well. It's repeating 19th century visions of empire, fighting against, or visions of empire which have not died. And of course, commentators like Karaganov do argue that ultimately this war is an opportunity for Russia precisely to define its identity, to give up this 500-year false attempt to become a European power, though he himself is ambiguous. So the way I would say it is that we are seeing the emergence of a post-Western Russia, but not a post-European one. And because for just simply geography won't, Russia is a European power. It's also an Asian power, a Eurasian power, but it's their neighbors. So, well, and I speak as a European, and I've always argued that we do need, and as one of the last Gaullists in England, to argue that we do need to have a pan-continental vision, one form or another, some sort of political community, because, as you well know, in Russia we have 145 million citizens who are, obviously a huge diversity of peoples, the Buryats and many, many others, but ultimately their culture is European. They have a common sense of cultural orientations, well, I'm going to put it, multiple religious faiths, but so I don't want to emphasize the Christian, but certainly a highly Christianized culture amongst other religions to be respected, of course, just as Europe has to face that as well. So in other words, the civilizational dimension is both exacerbating, but ultimately perhaps provides a framework for that peace which we so much desire.